You're listening to Off the Rails, a fortnightly video game and video game adjacent podcast. I'm the offrailgamer, and I'll be your host for this evening's broadcast. Hello my Organauts, and welcome to episode 42 of Off the Rails, also known as Series 2, episode 15. Allow me first to say this week's episode may be a little shorter than usual, and there are two reasons for this. One, you can probably hear I have a stinking cold, and honestly I don't know if my voice will hold out. And two, I've been away this past week, which has left me preparing this week's script rather last minute. But this may be a point of interest to some of you listening, particularly if you're part of the retro gaming community on TikTok and Twitch. This last week, I had the pleasure of vacationing with one 8-Bit Barber, LewAudio, Secretary Steve, and Lull. For those of you who don't know these gentlemen, I would like to give them a shout out. You can find 8-Bit Barber and LewAudio on both TikTok and Twitch, and I highly recommend you try catching their live streams. They're both highly entertaining, and I'm sure you'll find the community welcoming too. Anyway, I also have some plugs of my own to make, so I'll tell you where you can find me online as well. Off the Rails goes out on Spotify, Castbox, Amazon Music, and YouTube every other Thursday. I also maintain a YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok channel. And lastly, we have a semi-regular segment on the show called Listeners' Whispers, in which I read out messages sent in from my Organauts, the listeners at home. If you'd like to get involved in this segment, there's just 3 things you need to do. Send an email to offrailgamer@gmail.com, keep your message clean, and don't be mean. You'll find links to all of the above in the podcast episode description, because I'm nice like that. For now, let me tell you about what I've been playing recently. Before I embarked on my trip, I continued my playthrough of Red Dead Redemption 2. I'm in the later stage of the main storyline, but still have a good few missions before the end. It's all a bit doom and gloom, so I think we should hurry on to something a bit lighter before I give away any spoilers. I recently picked up the original Tomb Raider trilogy for Blaze Entertainment's Evercade. I wasn't sure how they'd play squeezing the 3 titles onto one cartridge. The controls are slightly janky, and the jump button doesn't always register in time, particularly when attempting a running jump. Saying that, I was playing on the original Evercade handheld, so it might prove more fluid on the Versus home console. Also, there could be a future patch I could download to the handheld. Aside from that, the games play pretty well, and it was neat getting to take them on the go with me and play them at the airport and during my flights. I got home to some deliveries I'd ordered while out of the country, and I'm excited to tell you that we have some new content for next year's Atari April. Firstly, I got a second copy of Combat, as it came in a bundle of games. This is no bad thing for me because it's a fun game, and doesn't hurt to have a backup copy. There are different game modes you can play in Combat, but you really are best off inviting a friend over to square off against. My favourite is the first game mode, in which you duke it out in a tank battle. I also got Street Racer, another driving game that utilises the paddle controls. Being a fan of games like Night Driver, Grand Prix and Pole Position, I'm super excited to spend more time with this one. Then, I added basketball to my collection. I got the hang of scoring quickly enough, but I need to practice stealing the ball away from my opponent in order to put more distance between our scores. But get this! I also grabbed my hands on Double Dragon and Space Invaders for the Atari. I definitely need to practice both of these, particularly Double Dragon, which totally kicked my butt, but I know I'm going to have a great time with these. At the time of writing this script, I'm also waiting on the delivery of Super Mario Bros. For the Atari, and Kirikou, Swing, Ballistic and Wacky Races, all for the PS1, and Sonic X Shadows Generations for the PS5. But I haven't had a chance to play these yet, so they'll have to feature in the next podcast. I'm going to do things a bit differently this week. primarily because there are a few topics I wanted to cover, but I want to be able to do them justice when I'm back to full health. As such, I'm going to go right off topic and talk about some of the films I've been watching and re-watching recently. But in order to justify it, I'm going to kick things off with a short look at the games that inspired this. When I was a student, most of my friends were playing Red Dead Redemption, which I'll come back to later. At the time, I didn't have a current gen console, being the PS3 or Xbox 360, so I bought a copy of Gun for the PS2 instead, and I have to say, I wasn't disappointed with it. In Gun, you play as Colton Cole White, an Apache who was adopted and taught the way of things by his pa, Ned White. The main villain is Major Tom Magruder, who's overseeing the installation of a new railroad through Apache land while simultaneously searching for Quivira? The lost city of gold, anyway. The game starts with Ned and Cole boarding a steamboat, which is attacked and ultimately blown up, with Ned still on board, having pushed Cole over the railings first. Cole embarks on a mission to find the men responsible, and slowly uncovers information leading to the man at the top. It's been a long time since I played Gun, so I can't spoil anything because, honestly, I need to sit down with it again to refresh my memory. Anyway, some years later I did finally come to Red Dead Redemption for myself. The year is 1911, and the days of the Old West are almost over. There are just a few loose ends that still need tying up, and our boy John Marston has been picked up by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to be sent to tie those loose ends. As it happens, John once ran with the Dutch van der Linde gang, ruthless outlaws who have no place in the newly forming society. John is taken down to New Hanover and a small town called Armadillo, from which he starts his hunt for former gangmate Bill Williamson. Without giving away too much, your search will take you south of the border down Mexico way, where you'll touch base with one Javier Escuela and Bill Williamson, before heading back north to catch up with Dutch van der Linde himself, John's former leader stroke mentor. Red Dead Redemption tells a compelling story and has you meet some rather colourful characters along the way, including Nigel West Dickens, a snake oil salesman, and Seth, a grubby grave robber who seems far too intimate with those he robs for my comfort. And of course, you know I've been playing Red Dead Redemption 2 again. I do plan to give an episode or more to each of these games in the future, so I think we can press on. I should give an honourable mention to Red Dead Revolver first, which I do have in my collection, but am yet to sit down and play through. Additionally, I also have in my collection 2 rail shooters, Gunfighter, The Legend of Jesse James, and Gunfighter 2, Revenge of Jesse James. So, you'll have noticed by now that all of these games are westerns. That is to say, they're cowboy games. And honestly, the first Red Dead Redemption game restored my love for the film genre. So here then is a list of some of the films I've watched and re-watched recently, alongside my playthrough of RDR2. And we kick things off with a Clint Eastwood film. There will be a few of these, but first up is Hang 'em High. Clint Eastwood plays Jed Cooper, a former lawman turned cattle rancher. That is, until a group of vigilantes track him down and find him in possession of a misappropriated herd. The man Jed thought he had bought the cows from is in fact dead, and the vigilantes decide to serve out their own justice, stringing up Jed Cooper there and then. Jed is found and cut down before his untimely death, and starts off after the men that had prematurely decided to lynch him. Along the way, he is deputized by the mayor of the nearest town, and is instructed to bring in all of the men alive so that they may be tried and hanged within the limits of the law. It's a gritty tale featuring Eastwood's usual stoic, strong and silent type character. His pursuit of the would-be killers is captivating and really does make for a compelling watch. I highly recommend this movie. Which I can't at this time say for Once Upon a Time in the West. Famously one of the greatest westerns ever made, I have to say I felt it was hugely overrated. It tells the story of a woman who's married into a family, only they all wind up murdered before she arrives to live with them. Her husband had bought up some land that no one else could see any value in. He'd also bought a load of timber, and when I say a load of timber, we're talking enough to build a small town. Turns out the railroad company is laying tracks that will run through the man's land, and he found a fresh water spring, which is the only water source for miles around, so he got the idea he could build a town where the train would need to stop to take on water. Under the terms of the purchase of land, he must have a fully constructed train station before the railroad company reaches his land with the tracks they're laying, or ownership of the land will revert back to the bank and can be sold to the highest bidder. The men that killed this man and all his kids didn't know he was already married, and that little Miss New in town had inherited as his sole remaining kin. That's the main gist of Once Upon a Time in the West, except Charles Bronson keeps wandering around playing a harmonica and smiling at folks. Either that or putting a bullet in them. It's an okay film, but I found the plot to be very weak, and honestly if it had any pace about it, it could have been wrapped up in about 90 minutes instead of the 2 hours 55 runtime. Sure, I'll give it a second chance sometime, but if you're new to westerns yourself, I certainly wouldn't start with this one. There are much snappier titles to get you into the genre, such as the 1966 film Django. Django finds a woman who's been taken up with a group of Mexican bandits. He sees them knocking her about a bit, and they tie her to a post. At that moment, a group of revolutionaries appear and kill the Mexicans. Turns out they consider the woman to be their property and are disappointed at her for living with the Mexicans. Django saves her, killing the revolutionaries, and takes her back into town where he is confronted by more revolutionaries. He strikes a deal working with them to collect a fortune's worth of gold, but rather than ending their agreement, the revolutionaries try to force Django to continue working with them. So he steals the gold and makes his escape with the girl. Out on the road, they are ambushed by Mexican bandits who shoot the woman dead and break both of Django's hands, leaving him to face the revolutionaries in a pitiful condition. This film is exciting from start to finish and runs for around an hour and a half. The blood does look a little bit like tomato ketchup, but honestly, do yourself a favour and allow yourself to invest and immerse yourself in this film because, in my opinion, it truly is cinematic gold. The Revenant is a much more recent film starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hardy. Leo portrays real-life historical figure Hugh Glass, though the film doesn't tell his story entirely accurately. See, Hugh was part of a skinning operation hunting for pelts out in the wilderness, and Hugh was badly mauled by a grizzly bear, as portrayed in the film. Hugh was left for dead, and did survive to track Tom Hardy's character with a view to killing him in revenge. However, in the film, Hugh gets his revenge and gifts Tom Hardy to the native population for a good old-fashioned scalping, whereas in real life, I think Tom Hardy's character was serving in the military, and Glass was ordered to let it go, lest he find himself arrested. Needless to say, though, The Revenant is a very exciting movie, and even though there's little in the way of dialogue for much of it, it really does race along. Definitely worth a watch if you ask me. Now, let's talk Clint Eastwood again, in The Outlaw Josie Wales. Josie Wales was minding his farmstead during the American Civil War when Union soldiers rode through, murdering his wife and son and burning his house to the ground. Josie then signs up with the Confederates so he can hunt his family's killers. At the end of the war, his group are among the last to hold out and are called to sign their surrender. But Josie still hasn't sought his revenge against the men who took everything from him, so he opts to mark himself as an outlaw and continue hunting his wife and child's killers. This is another compelling story that is well told and for me ranks up there as one of the top westerns. Next up, I want to talk briefly about The Alamo. This tells the story of a group of Americans led by Davy Crockett in the defense of the Alamo in Texas against the Mexican army. They are cut off from reinforcements and are subjected to a brutal siege that tests them physically, but also pushes their morale to the limits as the Mexicans keep them deprived of sleep under barrages of artillery fire and their army brass orchestra playing through the nights as well. I first saw this film around 10 years ago and only half paid attention, pretty much writing it off, but giving it a second chance this year, it now stands much higher in my estimation, and I would suggest you give it a watch. Which leaves me time to talk about just two more movies, and in my opinion I've saved the best for last, starting with The Magnificent Seven. Not the remake, but the proper film, with Steve McQueen and Yul Brynner and Charles Bronson. Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen roll into a town where a fella's been killed and left out in the street. The townsfolk advise they can't get the body to the cemetery to bury him because anyone who tries will be shot. So, being a couple of quick draws, they escort the coffin so the funeral can be held. For their bravery, they are asked to help a village in Mexico that is being terrorized by bandits, and they set about putting together a small posse, totaling 7, to go south and deal with the troublemakers. It's a premise that was copied in The Three Amigos, in which Steve Martin, Chevy Chase and Martin Short are Hollywood actors who portray heroes in silent films and are invited to protect a village in Mexico against bandits. Mistakenly believing they're putting on a show, they oblige and find themselves in way over their heads when they get there and find out it's real. But we were talking The Magnificent Seven, in which our heroes find themselves outnumbered, but decide they'll give it all to try and defy the odds. It's a great film, as is The Three Amigos. They're both great films. Anyway, for the astute among you, you'll recognise this means we've got just one more film that I want to talk about, and it's not Uphill All the Way, which is a terrible film. In fact, this is my favourite Western and has to rank in my top 10 favourite films of all time. And to avoid keeping you on tenterhooks any longer, I can tell you it's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach. These three were the Western genre. Clint Eastwood is the good, though at the start of the film he and Eli Wallach are working together to scam law authorities. Wallach's character has a bounty of $3,000 on his head, so Eastwood's character, known as Blondie despite his brown hair, keeps turning him in and then shooting the hangman's rope to free his companion of the noose. Rinse and repeat, except Blondie decides the con's run its course and cuts Wallach loose. Many different events unfold, and the good, the bad and the ugly all end up chasing Confederate treasure buried in a Civil War cemetery. I won't say any more because I honestly think you should go ahead and watch the film yourself if you haven't seen it already. And that is it from me for another week. Thank you for listening, and do check my YouTube this Saturday. I'm actually posting some content. Well, bye then.